Hi, my name is Matthew Lassman, and I am a second-year master's student at the University of Montreal under the supervision of Dr. Jeff Caron. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Dr. Amanda Black and Dr. Scott Rathwell, for their support. I'd also like to thank SSHRC for their funding of this research project. Today, I'm going to share with you some preliminary results from my master's thesis that explores student athletes' perceptions of psychological readiness to return to sport following a concussion. So psychological readiness has already been explored in athletes following musculoskeletal injuries such as ACL tears and has been found to be composed of 3 dimensions. The first is confidence in returning to sport, including confidence in their progress throughout rehab, as well as low fear of re-injury. Realistic expectations of sporting ability, such as realizing that the athlete's been injured and setting small goals or building blocks to re-achieve previous performance. And the third is motivation to regain previous performance during training, during rehab, and a readiness to work hard. However, this idea of psychological readiness has not yet been explored in concussed athletes. Athletes are currently recommended to progress through a 6-step return to sport process that gradually increases in physical and cognitive exertion to make sure that athletes are physically ready to return to sport. Beyond noting that the goals of step 4 are to increase thinking and step 5 are to restore confidence, psychological variables are largely overlooked in the current return to sport process for concussed athletes. There is evidence that additional psychological variables such as fear could be involved, but these are not sufficiently explored in the current return to sport process. Therefore, the objective of my study is to explore the factors that student athletes believe are involved in feeling psychologically ready to return to sport following a concussion. To do this, my study uses qualitative methods and a constructivist philosophical position, which means that I perceive reality to be relative and knowledge to be subjective. My study is overarched by a narrative methodology, which seeks to understand participants' experiences as told through stories. In my study, I had 12 participants with an equal representation of males and females who were formerly concussed student athletes between the ages of 18 and 25. They competed in sports with high rates of concussion based on sport injury surveillance data for this age group and experienced symptoms lasting longer than 1 month, who was thought to underscore the factors involved in feeling psychologically ready. So this is to highlight some of the variety within my participants, and they competed in a variety of sport. And the range of concussions that they experienced were between 1 and 7, so a wide variety here. As well, the recovery duration lasted from as little as 6 weeks to as many as 104 weeks, and in one case, one athlete had some ongoing symptoms. There was also a variety of return to sport outcomes in my participants, either returning to sport the same season, the next season, or were forced to retire. So each of the 12 participants participated in 2 virtual interviews over Zoom with me, on average lasting an hour and a half, for a total of 24 total interviews. The goal of the first interview was to understand their concussion experience, and that included exploring aspects such as differences between their concussion and other types of injuries, as well as factors involved in feeling ready, both physically ready and psychologically ready, and differentiating the two. The goal of the second interview was to reflect and provide advice to others in the sport environment, such as reflecting on a successful versus unsuccessful return to sport and practical tips for developing an athlete's readiness. I proposed to analyze my data using creative nonfiction to compose 2 to 3 composite narratives of about 400 to 500 words each. I propose a 2-step approach. The first is an initial story analyst phase that involves immersing myself in the data, such as through the collection of field notes and transcribing interviews, to identify, connect, and describe key experiences and themes, and then to categorize these into common themes across participants, as well as highlight unique experiences for each participant. Then to shift over to a storyteller phase, which involves developing narrative structures around these 2 categories, as well as draft the stories and weave participant voices throughout, and to send the stories to participants for their feedback and reflections. So from here, I'd like to share with you some preliminary results that I've gathered. One of the results was challenges with uncertain recovery, including an indefinite timeline nonlinear progress, fear of long-term cognitive effects, the role of identity, either renegotiation following forced retirement or as an underlying mechanism for motivation, as well as this idea of feeling inadequately supported during concussion recovery. And so these are some differences compared to previous findings on musculoskeletal injuries. So I'd like to read now a few quotations from participants regarding each of these results. In terms of challenges with uncertain recovery, one athlete spoke about not having a definitive timeline makes concussion recovery really different than other injuries. It's frustrating because I'd love to know an exact date. It's been 1.5 years or so now. And so this is an athlete who is still experiencing some of the ongoing symptoms of concussion. Another athlete said, pretty much at every stage I had setbacks. The doctor gave me this structured step-by-step plan to come back to sport, but the process wasn't so linear. There were a lot of steps backwards. And so this is a nice hockey player who experienced a 30-week recovery before returning to sport. As well, fear of long-term cognitive effects played an important role in this athlete's readiness to return to sport. He said, "Am I ever going to feel normal again?" I thought to myself, this could be a lot bigger than just hockey. This could go on for 5, 10 years, who knows? You hear the stories of NHL and NFL players who are still suffering problems. Is 2 more years of playing hockey really worth the potential of losing cognitive function when I'm 40 or 50? I had to learn to manage that fear when returning to hockey. So this was following a 14-week concussion recovery. The role of renegotiating identity also seemed to play a role in feeling ready to return to sport, or return to life in this case. I felt at the time that I'd lost everything. It was that realization of, you're not a football player anymore, so who are you? It took me 2 years to find out who I wanted to be. You try to fill up that time, that void that was previously filled by football. And so this is a quotation from an athlete who was forced to retire as a result of his concussions. Identity can also be an underlying mechanism of a motivational factor. For example, this athlete spoke that every day, all I thought was about getting back on the ice. Everyone wants to go back to being who they are. My identity drove me to want to come back. And so this is a ringette player who recovered in a 6-week timeline. Finally, inadequate social support was a particularly salient theme for this participant. My coach didn't care that I had a concussion. He never texted me about my diagnosis or to see how I was doing. I did everything to get his approval, but I never did. If you would have asked me, even with my biggest headache, if I was ready to go, I would say yes, no question about it. I wish he would have checked up on me, even just one time. I definitely felt pressure to go back. So my study has the potential to contribute in a number of ways. For one, this is the first study to examine this idea of feeling psychologically ready among formerly concussed athletes. Additionally, this study allows us to compare psychological readiness following a concussion to previous literature on following musculoskeletal injury. As well, I highlight additional factors and underlying mechanisms that underpin this idea of feeling ready to return to sport, and differentiate between feeling physically ready versus psychologically ready to return to sport after concussion. Finally, my study offers practical applications through participants' voices to foster an athlete's readiness. So thank you for your time.